I'm also pleased to report that I finished Udolpho. So I started this during the Boutique Readathon in October because I thought it'd be fun as like a spooky read, and I got like a third of the way through, which a third of the way through is like 230 pages in, you know, because it's a long one, and just not much was happening. There were these interesting little tidbits of mysteries, but it just was kind of dragging, and so I put it aside. It turns out like their real action starts like right after I put it down. So I really quickly got into this again and read it quite fast. It was, as Henry Tilney said in Northanger Abbey, I read it with my hair standing on end the whole time. I definitely was reading quickly, and it was probably good that, you know, I'd started slow, because I knew that like I'd already read a bunch of her beautiful descriptive nature passages. So like if I got to a part that was really exciting and then all of a sudden, you know, Emily is like at this random farmhouse in the Tuscan countryside, and she's like having a sort of little respite, and it's beautifully described, but like I just want to see her get back to Udolpho and find out what's happening, so I would just kind of like skim pretty quickly. Yeah, I absolutely loved it. I would like to read another Anne Radcliffe, and it definitely is a great thing to have read if you've read Northanger Abbey. I always thought, oh, well, I enjoy Northanger Abbey. I don't really need to have read, I mean, obviously I wanted to at some point, but I didn't feel like, you know, sort of urgency to get to Anne Radcliffe. There were just so many Northanger Abbey moments. All these little things that Jane Austen had taken and put into Northanger Abbey that just made so much more sense. So if you've been sleeping on Anne Radcliffe or Mysteries of Udolpho, don't do that. I mean, know that the first third of the book is going to be slow going. But after that, I would say, you know, the story really drew me along, and I wanted to know what was happening. And it was like lots of action, lots of drama, lots of suspense. Catherine in Northanger Abbey is excited to go to the Abbey because of the incredible castles that she's read about in Mysteries of Udolpho. And so, you know, we have these incredible castles, these incredible situations, and yet the heroine, Emily, she lives at La Vallée. I wanted to call her Emily La Vallée. Her name is Emily St. Aubert. Emily St. Aubert, it almost can't believe the situations she's in sometimes. I mean, it's funny because she herself is, you know, sort of a typical Gothic heroine. She's beautiful. She has these young men who are fainting away for love of her. She is constantly fainting away. At like every critical moment, I'm like, don't faint, Emily. She can't take it. But she does still have this strength of character, and there are some times when she, you know, stands up for herself, and she has this kind of strength of principle. And even in these crazy situations, she doesn't like automatically believe, you know, what she's told. Like if she hears a ghost story, she'll like kind of smile at Annette, her servant, and be like, Annette, is that really, like there's some really sweet, funny conversations between them. And of course, there are times when Emily obviously like feels like, did I just see a spirit? Like that must have been what I saw. In Northanger Abbey, Catherine's imagination is influenced by these stories. But it's interesting that like even in the story, even in Udolpho, there is a certain level of groundedness and realism, and like Emily St. Aubert like trying to be sort of rational and fight against her imagination, which obviously in Northanger Abbey, it's like Catherine Morland just imagines all of it, whereas in Udolpho, it's like Emily wishes she was imagining all of it. Some of it is totally real and justified, these crazy things that are happening to Emily, but like other parts of it, it's like, well, maybe they do have a rational explanation. So I'll go ahead and give a spoiler warning, total spoiler warning for Udolpho if you are planning to read it for yourself and want to be, you know, and don't want it any more spoiled than it's been by Northanger Abbey, which Northanger Abbey doesn't really spoil it, although there was a moment when I was reading Udolpho and I like finally got to the part with the black veil, which Isabella teases Catherine Morland about, and Catherine says what she thinks is behind the black veil, and I was like, did Catherine Morland just spoil Udolpho for me? I mean, to be fair, Catherine Morland at that point was just saying what she thought was behind the black veil. She didn't like know for sure. So, you know, did she spoil it? I don't know. But anyway, I don't want to spoil it for you. If you're going to watch Udolpho, go ahead. I'll maybe put the timestamp on the screen that you should skip ahead to, or you can mute and wait until I'm holding up a different book or in a different scene. So we talked about how it's kind of a slow start. we meet Emily and her parents. Her parents quickly die off. She meets Valancourt, this very romantic young man who I mentioned back in October that I liked how her father said, here is a young man who's never been to Paris. Like, he's just totally unspoiled. And Emily and her ailing father and Valancourt ends up joining them, kind of go on this beautiful trip through the Pyrenees. Emily's father dies. There's some mysterious stuff. There's like these papers that he tells her to burn. Her father was a really upright guy, but unfortunately her remaining living relatives are really not great. Her uncle and her aunt are just pretty much awful. Her aunt becomes her guardian, so she goes to live with her aunt. And Valancourt does visit there. At first they don't want her to marry Valancourt. Then they're like, okay, I guess you can marry Valancourt. And they're preparing for the wedding, but then Emily's aunt says, actually, I changed my mind. I'm going to marry this sketchy Italian guy who's been courting me. And so all of the wedding preparations that we've been getting ready for Emily's wedding are actually going to be for my wedding. And then they say, actually, no, you can't marry Valancourt. And Valancourt gets sent away. And Valancourt says to Emily, like, you should just run away with me. Because obviously this Italian, his name is Montoni, that, your aunt is marrying is obviously bad news. But Emily is like, no, it can't be that bad. She's my guardian. I don't want to, go against her. It would be wrong to get married in secret. Emily has such high morals. Sometimes, if you're putting yourself in the power of this evil Italian that your aunt just married, like maybe to avoid that evil, it is okay to go against your aunt's wishes and just marry Valancourt because you do trust Valancourt. You trust his character, whereas the stallion, his character, you definitely shouldn't trust. Yeah, I find that part of the story kind of frustrating. I was like, oh my gosh, Emily, just marry Valancourt right now. But of course, then there would not be a whole novel. At one point, Emily asks herself this question of like, has my ingeniousness deserved this? Which I feel like I had this general impression that ingenious meant something more along the lines of like genius, like evil sort of clever plans. But actually ingenious just means innocent, But when Emily asked herself that, I was like, yes, it does, because you knew you should not have trusted that Italian. Instead of marrying Valancourt, you went with your aunt, and you knew your aunt wasn't trustworthy. Sorry, I'll stop ranting about Emily. In spite of her frequent fainting, like, I did respect her. There was something likable about her in spite of it all. It's funny, because in Rebecca, Daphne du Maurier, I need to try another Daphne du Maurier, or try Rebecca again at some point, but the heroine of Rebecca is kind of like Emily St. Aubert, but like totally helpless. Like just can't, it feels like the obstacles in front of Emily St. Aubert are actually pretty formidable. And like, I don't know, after that initial moment where she should not have ever trusted her aunt and Montoni, like after that I can kind of forgive her because, it is difficult to get out of her situation. Whereas in Rebecca, with the heroine, like I felt like all of the obstacles were just created by her own mind, and so I couldn't sympathize with her. I was just so annoyed by her. Whereas Emily, I feel like I'm giving a bad impression. She didn't really annoy me that much. It was more a sort of humorous thing. Anyway, Emily does not marry Valancourt. She goes with her aunt and Montoni to Italy, and first they spend a whole bunch of time in Venice, and it is beautiful, really fun to hear the descriptions of Venice, but that was the point I gave up, because I was like, we've already been through like so many changes of scenery and character, and like nothing has really happened, and I just thought, I'll just put it aside. Montoni and Emily's aunt want her to marry this Count Morano in Venice. And she does not want to marry him. She says, no, absolutely not. And they say they're going to force her to marry him. They're like, here's your wedding dress. Tomorrow morning, you're just marrying him. And she's like, it doesn't work that way. Like, if you take me before the priest and I say no, I'm not married. Anyway, Emily is saved from this marriage by an unexpected decision of Montoni, the Italian, to pack up his whole family and go out to his castle in the remote mountains, the Apennines, I think. And the castle is called Udolpho. Up until that point, I don't think we know who or what Udolpho is, so that was kind of an exciting moment to be like, that's Udolpho. It's when she arrives at Udolpho that I feel like the hair-raising moments really begin. Like, then I could understand why Henry Tilney took the book away and did not read it out loud to his sister like he said he was going to. Because it just goes from one bad thing to the next. Mysterious voices and mysterious music. at Udolpho, and like sometimes there are mysterious lights out on the terrace. By this point, it is totally clear that Montoni is totally evil, and he wants Emily's aunt to sign these papers to resign her wealth, but she keeps refusing to. This is where we finally see the black veil, and Emily is so curious what's behind it. Annette, her servant, first mentions it to her, and also tells her about Laurentini, who was the previous owner of the castle, this lady who disappeared randomly under mysterious circumstances. They think maybe Montoni, the Italian, murdered her. And I didn't even realize this until later in the book, but she's in front of the black veil and she faints. And I thought she just fainted because couldn't even take the thought of what was behind the black veil. And at the time I was like, just lift it up and see. But I must have missed it in the text that she did, either the veil blew forward, or at that moment she actually did get a glimpse of what was behind the veil. Later at Udolpho, she is locked up in the gatehouse, and there's this curtain at the far end of the room, and she does have the courage to pull it back, and there is a dead body behind it. So I was like, how did you have the courage to pull that one curtain back, but you couldn't pull the black veil back, which at first I thought there was just a painting behind the black veil. Anyway. See, now you can see why Catherine was appreciative to have Isabella to talk about these things, because now I can't stop talking about the black veil. And it was literally the last paragraph in this 600-page book when we find out what was behind the black veil. It was a good explanation. I enjoyed it. Anyway, Emily's afraid the Italian is going to murder her aunt to try to get the possession of her estate, which actually Emily is supposed to inherit the estate. So it's kind of funny. At first, Emily is horrified because she thinks Montoni has murdered her aunt. But then it turns out he didn't actually murder her. He just locked her into the east turret and kind of let her starve to death. So, while Emily is locked up at Udolpho, there are all these banditti, all these sort of criminal types start appearing around the castle, basically sort of a mini army. And Emily is is Montoni a robber? Has he become a captain of the bandits? And Anne Radcliffe writes a little explanation of well, no, he wasn't really a captain of the bandits, because at that time in Italy, the state was very unstable, and when there weren't actually wars in progress, the army wouldn't really disband. It would kind of form into these mini gangs of bandits, and then some of these noblemen would captain them. And so it's Anne Radcliffe, come on. So it just felt like this long-winded explanation of well, Montoni's not really a captain of the bandits, he's just a captain of the bandits. Honestly, when Emily finally escapes from Udolpho, at every moment that she and the group are making their way to the coast and trying to find a ship to France, I was like, Montoni's gonna catch them. Montoni's gonna catch them. I was reading that part so fast. I was like, he's gonna catch them. He's gonna catch them. And surprisingly, they made it to the boat and he didn't catch them. And then as soon as they get on the boat, we shift scene and we go kind of back to a place that, to the place where Emily's father actually passed away, because it was during Emily's travels. They randomly ended up at this sort of ruined chateau, not dissimilar to Udolpho, very Gothic, very, tapestries and wainscoting. And it becomes clear that Saint-Aubert knew the lady, the Marchioness of the chateau, who died mysteriously many years before. And there's also music haunting this castle. The beginning was slow, but there were a lot of tiny mysteries set up at the beginning that were resolved. It was really fun to see every single one of them resolved at the end. And all of those supernatural mysteries, every single one of them had a rational explanation. None of them was left as actually supernatural. Emily has finally gotten free, and then all of a sudden we're in this completely different place, and there's a completely different young lady. Her name's Blanche. She's just like Emily, but except she hasn't been locked up in an Italian castle yet. But it's probably coming. A couple chapters after we get to know Blanche and get to know this second castle, Blanche, it's right on the coastline, right on the Mediterranean, and they look out into this ship that is almost about to be shipwrecked in the storm, but is saved. And who is on the ship but Emily and her party? And of course, it's so ironic that here she winds up back at this castle where there was clearly a mystery that she's related to, and gradually that becomes that is unfolded. Meanwhile, Valancourt, unfortunately, has been to Paris, and he has gotten involved in gaming, and Emily thinks that, you know, he's lost her esteem, and so that's very painful. But it does wind up with a very happy ending. I already gave the spoiler warning, so I guess I can tell you that they do end up together. Although, see, there's this other guy named Dupont, who is one of the sources of the mysterious music, and he has loved Emily for a long time, and he was actually locked up with her at Udolpho, and she thought it was Valancourt. That was a great scene. Emily thought Valancourt was a prisoner at Udolpho, and her maid, like, there's this series of misunderstandings, and her maid finally brings up the gentleman who was a prisoner, and the whole time when the Annette was coming in, I was like, it's not Valancourt, it's not Valancourt. And then Emily faints because it's not Valancourt. Valancourt's in Paris. Anyway, the guy his name is Dupont. And honestly, I kind of wanted Emily to end up with Dupont. Valancourt is just so over the top. And Emily, in spite of all her fainting away, I feel like was a little bit more grounded than Valancourt. It's like the conversations between Emily and Valancourt never really go anywhere. High flow and so romantic, and Valancourt never comes to the point. Like, he is actually innocent of the worst of the accusations against him, and if he had just told Emily that to begin with, if he had just insisted to begin with that she run away with him, well, then there would have been no story, and it was a really fun story. We even get to meet Laurentina. So thrilling. The connection between Emily's father and the Marchioness also, I didn't see it coming. It turned out they were siblings. Because, like, there's totally this undercurrent of, is Emily actually the daughter of the Marchioness? Were the Marchioness and her father secretly married before the Marchioness married this other guy? Hopefully you've read Udolpho, and that's why you're still listening to me ramble, because if you haven't read Udolpho, I'm probably not doing a great job explaining it. I really probably should start Northanger Abbey right away, because I feel like I need to talk about Udolpho, which clearly Catherine Morland felt the same urge. Anyway, I'm so glad Febregency brought me back to Anne Radcliffe and back to Udolpho, because it was very exciting and a great Regency read.